We're still sauntering our way through Genesis, and we're talking about the patriarchs is what we ostensibly called it. It's actually the promise in the patriarchs, because there's a promise that extends, we'll say this over and over again, starts with Abraham, works its way through mankind up to Jesus, and Paul tells us that the seed of Abraham through which this promise is coming is Jesus. So the promise that we enjoy a life through Jesus actually started with Abraham, which is why we're back there looking at this. Now, if you've been astute, you've noticed that a lot of people in the story so far have missed the promise, like Sodom and Gomorrah. And that's deliberate on God's part to tell you that the whole plan of salvation, this promise that God has for us, although it's unilateral on his part, it is conditional on our receiving it. Not earning it, not being worthy of it, but receiving it. And people all through the story in the Old Testament and in the New will miss it because they, in the pridefulness of the hardness of their hearts, they won't receive it. Sodom and Gomorrah was one of them. And we'll look at a few more today. So these are people who are living right next to the promise. I mean, the people in Sodom and Gomorrah were living with Lot, who understood what the promise was all about. Lot came from Ur with Abraham. So he knew what the nature of this was, and yet they rejected it. So that's what we're looking at. There are this promise that exists that is to every human being, that starts with Abraham and extends to us through the payment of what Jesus has done for us. And that promise is available if we'll accept. So today we're going to do a little housekeeping. We're going to introduce characters and get rid of characters, and then next time together we'll be at one of the most important places in the Old Testament where Abraham sacrifices Isaac. But before we leave Sodom and Gomorrah behind, I want you to see what Peter wrote about Sodom and Gomorrah. In 2 Peter 2, he said, he condemned the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah to destruction by reducing them to ashes, having made them an example to those who would live ungodly lives thereafter. And so from that point on, Sodom and Gomorrah stands as this data point in history that says God sees and God will judge. No one gets out without being understood by God in his heart. So that's why that's there. And to this very day, even in our popular vernacular, when you talk about Sodom and Gomorrah in secular society, people, they know. This was a long time ago, 4,000 years ago. And yet people know Sodom and Gomorrah, that's where people were really bad and God destroyed them, right? Right. Judgment is coming and there'll be more judgment. So anyway, we talked a lot about that last week. That's right. That's exactly right. Okay, we're going to get our last glimpse of Lot, and I wanted to push on past this, and I changed my mind. We're going to look at it anyway. We're going to see how Lot ends up, because this is the last chance you'll get to see Lot in the entirety of Genesis. What happened to Lot? This is the nephew of Abraham. If we go to chapter 19, the end of it, about verse 30, Lot went up from Zoar. Remember, that was that little town he had refuge from the destruction. And he stayed in the mountains, and his two daughters with him, for he was afraid to stay in Zoar. And he stayed in a cave, he and his two daughters. So now Lot is reduced to having lived in this wonderful place, Sodom and Gomorrah, that was actually quite civilized, although it was extremely evil. Exceedingly grave was their evil, it says. And now he's living up in the mountains in a cave with his two daughters. His wife, Lot's wife, what happened to her? She looked longingly back to Sodom, and she didn't make it. So what happened to the two sons-in-law? They thought Abraham was joking when he said the place is going to be destroyed. So now we have Lot and his two daughters in this cave right here. So what happens? Well, the firstborn says to the younger, by the way, I'm going to skip some verses in this to kind of speed us up this morning, so I encourage you to go back and read the entirety, but we're going to get the highlights. Verse 31, the firstborn said to the younger, hey, great idea. Our father's old. There's not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and let us lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. Good reaction. That's exactly right. So they're saying, listen, we're stuck in this cave with our dad. There's no men around. We lost our I don't know what you call them. They're kind of married, but they're not married, engaged. Okay, they're fiancés. There we go, fiancés. We'll use a nice French word. Yeah, so there we go. So there's no one around. So what are we going to do for our future? What are we going to do for our future? How are we going to have children? Let's get dad drunk. He'll have sex with us, and we'll have babies through our dad. Well, sort of. So here they are in a cave. This is their only chance. So the older one cooks up to this deal, and sure enough, she does it. I'm going to skip a few verses, and then after it's done with her, she comes back to her younger sister again, and in verse 34, she says, hey, The following day, the firstborn said to the younger, behold, I lay last night with my father. Let's make him drink wine tonight also, and then you go in and lie with him, that we may preserve our family through our father. Thus, both the daughters of Lot were with child by their father. See, that's why I wanted to skip it, kind of. But you have to understand, here is the sad end to Lot and his daughters, and maybe a little contamination from the ethics and morals of Sodom and Gomorrah. So what exactly happens here? Well, the firstborn bore a son and called his name Moab. Moab. And he is the father of the Moabites to this day. In fact, if you do a picture of Israel, there's Israel, and those blotches by color are the different tribes of Israel where they ended up settling so much longer after that. Moab are the people who live on down here. So if you go to Israel and you look on the eastern side of the Dead Sea in the very rocky, barren land down there, that's Moab. That's where the Moabites live. Or if you're in Utah, Moab is down there. But you got to understand, Moab here in Utah was named after Moab there in Israel, which is named after the incestuous son of Lot and his daughter. Moab. That's where it came from. What about the other one? Well, the other one, verse 38, as for the younger, she also bore a son, called his name Ben-Ami. He is the father of the sons of Ammon to this day, and the Ammonites lived over there. Now, as you go through the rest of Genesis, you'll see the Moabites, you'll see the Ammonites come back over and over again. If you're studying Deuteronomy with women right now, you've already seen them, I think, right? Did you get? Yeah, okay. So they show up everywhere. Just remember that these are the incestuous children of Lot and his two daughters, Moab and Ammon. And they end up being a problem for a long time. But the interesting thing is, they're not a problem because of their heritage, because they are from this weird, icky relationship. But they really are in the outs because of how they treated Israel. And it's very clear in the end of Deuteronomy, it says it really clearly as well. Here's what the two daughters learned in Sodom. They learned that manipulation is okay, that plying someone with wine is fine, and incest is just fine. Yeah, exactly. It's just like a hairball. So it's a horrible thing. Here's at the end of Deuteronomy 23. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord. Why? Because they came from this incestuous relationship? No. Because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. So Moab and the Ammonites, okay, they're like cousins to the Israelites, but they don't treat them as family, and so that's why they're shunned. So you watch that. You'll see them pop up all the way through. Okay, we're going to push on. Now we're going to get our first glimpse of Abimelech. By the way, that's your last glimpse of Lot. He will not show up again for the entire rest of the Bible. Bye-bye, Lot. Bye-bye his daughters, but the Moabites and the Ammonites, you'll see a lot of them. So here's this guy named Abimelech, and we're going to take a look at him. He comes in the story beginning of chapter 20. Now, Abraham journeyed from there toward the land of the Negev. That means he's going south into the desert. And he settled between Kadesh and Shur, and then he sojourned in Gerar. So he's actually in the southern end of Israel, kind of the deserty area, and he's moving. Gerar is more toward the coast. It's right on the edges of present-day Gaza is where it is. So he's down there, and then something remarkable happens. Abraham said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." Now, if you're having a serious deja vu moment, that's because he did this a few weeks ago, too. Well, several chapters back. So they're out here in Gerar. It's what we would call, as biblical scholars, the Philistine area. It's kind of the Philistine area. It's the coastal plains coming into the desert. And he's saying, "She's my sister." Now, remember, we did this once before, and we're gonna do it again right here. This is like a deja vu moment. So Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent, and he took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech in a dream of the night and said to him, "I love this." By the way, God can speak very clearly. So here's where he speaks very clearly. "Behold, you're a dead man." I like this. You're a dead man because of the woman whom you've taken, for she's married. So see, here's the deal, and we talked about this last time if you've forgotten. When someone was very beautiful, a woman was very beautiful, many times a suitor would want to take her as his wife, and in the process, if she was already married, for the sake of honor, the suitor would make sure she wasn't married. by killing the husband. And as, oh, sorry, your husband's dead. Why don't you marry me? I'll take care of you. And that would go on. So when you'd go in these godless lands, what Abraham cooked up with Sarah was, when we go to these kinds of places, tell people you're my sister, and then they won't kill me to get you. And in fact, not only that, but they'll pay me to take you, a dowry. That was the deal he cooked up. Because Abraham is spineless, again, is what it is. It's really not a good thing. So anyway, but the interesting thing is God comes to Abimelech, this king, and says, you're a dead man. The woman you've taken is married. Now, if Abimelech did not come from an ethical culture, this wouldn't bother him, but it does bother him. You don't take a woman who's married to another man with the intentions of marrying her. You just don't do that. Unless we're not going to go there. So she's married. So Abimelech had not come near her. He had not touched her. And he said, Lord, will you slay a nation even though blameless? Did he not himself say to me, she's my sister? And she herself said, he's my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I've done this. So he's really true. He's saying, listen, they both told me this was the case. I'm just going on what they said. Are you going to slay an entire nation? You're going to take me and all my people out because in my innocence I accepted their lie? Does that make sense? And it's an interesting thing. We're talking about a king who is a, quote unquote, a pagan king, but he understands something about the eternal justice of God Creator, this judge, that it would not be right for you to take me out just because they lied to me. You're not really going to do this, right? It's very reminiscent of Abraham when he's bargaining with God for the people who live in Sodom. Are you going to take out all of Sodom? What if there's even 10 people left? God says, no, I won't take it out even if there's 10 people. Same way he's saying here, you're a just God. You're not going to take us all out because I believe their lie, right? So then God said to him in a dream, yes, I know that in the integrity of your heart you have done this, and I also kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. So interestingly enough, Abimelech, his argument is making good, and God himself goes further and says, not only that, but I am the one, God says, I'm the one that kept you from touching her and going too far. I protected her. By the way, later on, way later in one of Peter's letters, he'll mention about the fact that the women of faith, and he's speaking implicitly about the Old Testament, they didn't live in fear because they trusted God. In this particular case, Sarah trusts God, and God protects her. Notice this? God says, I kept you from her. So he protects her. Didn't let you touch her. Well, it goes on. How's the story? Now, therefore, God's still speaking, restore the man's wife, for he's a prophet, and he'll pray for you, and you will live. But if you do not restore her, know that you shall surely die, you and all who are yours. Very clear. So I think Abimelech's got the message. Let's see. Keep the woman, we all die. Give the woman back, we all live. That sounds like a clear choice. So how's it happen? Here's how it turns out. So verse 8. So Abimelech arose early in the morning, called all of his servants, told all these things in their hearing, and the men were greatly frightened. So he's basically saying, listen, we believe this lie, and we could all die. All of us, because that's what God said. We could all die, which is why they're extremely frightened right here. We could all die. So this is what we're going to do. Verse 9, Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, what have you done to us? That's my interpretation of it. But what have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and on my kingdom a great sin? You've done to me things that ought not to be done. Whew. And Abimelech said to Abraham, what have you encountered that you've done these things? That is, what's made you want to do something like this that almost got us all killed? What's scaring you? What is it that's making... What's your problem? Why are you telling this lie? In fact, it's a fascinating thing from Abimelech's perspective. I mean, Abimelech has had this discussion with God. It says, you're going to die if you don't do this, and I've protected her from you. And here's this very powerful God who clearly is with Abraham. He's clearly with Abraham. And so Abimelech's saying, so what's the deal? This incredibly powerful God came and stopped me. He seems to be on your side. Why do you have to go around lying in the desert? You see the conflict? He doesn't quite get this. So Abraham comes back with a snappy comeback. Abraham says, well, because I thought surely there's no fear of God in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Besides, she actually is my sister.
There we go.
We should not excuse Abraham right here. He's acting like an idiot, is what he's doing. And he's actually made the story a little bit better from the last time we saw this happen with Pharaoh, because he's saying, well, actually, I'm not lying. Technically, I'm not lying. She's my sister. And she is. We're not going to look at it. You can read it for yourself. But sister, you mean Abraham married his sister? Well, his half-sister. They have the same father. They have different mothers. That's still kind of icky. Well, that is still kind of icky. But, the law hadn't been given until Moses, so it is probably okay. But you have to understand, too, we are here in the early parts of history after the flood. It turns out that 2 of the sons of Noah are still alive at this point in time. Weird, huh? So there is kind of this populating thing that's still going on around the earth. So, let's see. So they both have the same father, but not the same mother, which means that Isaac, who was born, only had one grandfather. Ew, that's weird. Okay, we're not going to go there. So actually, she is my sister. She's a half-sister is what it is. So Abimelech then took sheep and oxen, male and female servants, gave them to Abraham, and restored his wife Sarah to him. And Abimelech said, behold, my land is before you. Settle wherever you please. Now, that's a weird response, don't you think? Just a second ago, he says, what are you doing? You're getting us all killed. And at the end of this, after he gives him all these riches back, he says, feel free to settle anywhere you want. Why did he do that? Why did Abimelech offer him to settle anywhere you want? Yeah, Abraham has a good advocate in God. So Abimelech is he's gonna play things safe here. After all, here's the guy that protected Sarah when Abraham wasn't willing to protect her. What an idiot! If God is Abraham and Sarah's advocate, let's just be nice with this guy. You know what? Let's just act like it all didn't happen. You want to settle anywhere in my lands? Feel free. That's fine with me. Now, I kind of play that in a manipulative way, but it could very well be, in addition to that, Abimelech just has developed a very strong fear and respect for this God who seems to be lingering with Abraham, and decides, you know what? I'm going to treat this guy good because I need to be careful about his God. It's a real fear of God in that sense that's doing this, and that's okay as well. That's really okay as well. So he says, yeah, settle wherever you like to. So, and then to Sarah, I think this is marvelous. Abimelech has a private session with Sarah and says this, behold, I've given your brother 1,000 pieces of silver. So behold, it is your vindication before all who are with you and before all men, you are cleared. So in this process, what he's done publicly is say that Sarah has not been violated and she hasn't violated herself. She's still pure and clean. There's nothing wrong with what she's done. And this payment of this silver testifies that in a public way, which, by the way, is a lot of silver. It's a lot of silver. It's a worker, we know, if you look up the history back in Babylon around the same time, a day worker would be paid half of a piece of silver for a month's wages. So that same worker would have to take him 167 years to earn this much money. That's a lot of money. It's an awful lot of money. So Abimelech is trying to really come clean and come clean well. And he honors Sarah specifically, something Pharaoh didn't do the last time this happened. He honors Sarah specifically and says, I'm going to go above and beyond and out of my way to clear your reputation. And it's going to cost me 1,000 pieces of silver. I think it's very thought. Abimelech and Abraham, Abimelech is looking better and better all the time, and Abraham's looking like a jerk. In fact, the irony of the whole thing is that Abraham's explanation for why he did it was because I was afraid there'd be no one who feared God here, and yet Abimelech seems to fear God more than Abraham does. It's very interesting. Abimelech's a very honorable man here. So Abraham prayed to God. God healed Abimelech and his wife and his maids so that they bore children. For the Lord had closed fast all the wombs of the household of Abimelech because of Sarah, Abraham's wife. What? Yeah, see, this is another part of the side story that's going on, is that as long as Sarah was in the household, none of the women could bear children. So Abraham actually prays for this guy who originally came to him and said, what do you think you're doing? Because this guy does have a connection with God, and Abimelech is being blessed as a result of that. By the way, before we leave Abimelech, you have to know the name Abimelech is like the title Caesar or Pharaoh. It's not really someone's first name, it's the title of an office. And so you'll see Abimelech come back over and over again in the scriptures. You'll say, well, is that the same guy that was with Abraham? No, it's probably not the same guy. Isaac, closely after this, is going to deal with an Abimelech. It might be the same guy, but it's kind of a title. Well, for instance, Abraham, the name Abraham, the Ab part means father, right? Ab is father. So when you see Abimelech, the Ab means father. And Melech actually is a general Semitic term. It's not Hebrew, but a lot of the languages that ended up developing Hebrew use the same thing. Melech, well, Abraham met Melchizedek. Remember when he met Melchizedek? Well, that Melech and Melch mean the same thing, and Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Melchi is king, Tzedek is righteousness, king of righteousness. So this guy's name is really Father King, or my dad's the king. That's what it means. It's a title that would be given to a prince who was born of a king who was going to become the king. He'd be the Abimelech. My father's the king. And when he becomes king, he'd be given another title. So it's this guy's just, okay, there you go. So Abimelech means basically, my father's the king. Okay, we're going to get our first glimpse of Isaac finally. After 25 years, Isaac is going to be born to a very old man. Now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Woohoo! Baby, he's finally being born. Isaac is being born finally. He's 100 years old. By the way, Sarah is 10 years younger than Abraham, which makes Sarah 90. And yet the king of Gerar, Abimelech, looked at her and said, I want her. Exactly. And she's 90. Wow. I don't know where I'm going with that. But anyway, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac. You know who this person is, actually. You know who that is? Dustin Hoffman. Little Big Man. That's from Little Big Man. Made him 121 years old. That's what that picture is right there. Okay, so Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And we looked at this last week. We actually celebrated the birthday of Isaac last week, but we're going to say it's official today. And God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. I think she probably acted like this every time people would see Isaac. And she'd say, yeah, I was 90. And I think she might have admitted, yeah, and first time I heard this was going to happen, I laughed. Out of derision, I didn't think God could do it. But look, he's done it. So we have a little birthday celebration today as well. She said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet, I bore him a son in his old age. Wow, Isaac is born. Yay. But now 3 years later, the child grew, was weaned. Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned. This is a big deal. About 2 to 3 years after baby was born, you'd have a feast, you'd have a celebration, like a real birthday celebration, because infant mortality was so bad that you weren't really sure the baby was going to make it until you got to the time that the baby was weaned. And when the baby was weaned, you'd say, big sigh of relief, this child's going to make it. He's going to make it through the infant mortality rate. We're going to make it. So you have this big celebration. So it's 2 to 3 years later. Most people think about 3 years later. The big celebration happens, right? And Isaac has his big birthday celebration 3 years later. Great feast on the day when Isaac was weaned. Well, now Hagar enters into the story. And here's our last glimpse of Hagar. Now, at the same time, Sarah saw that the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. So this big celebration feast happens at the weaning. Big celebration feast about Isaac, big deal about Isaac. And who is mocking during that feast? When I first read this, I thought it was Hagar, but it's the nameless son of Hagar, the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, Ishmael. Ishmael's mocking. So when you get this weaning feast that's going on and celebrating the fact that this Isaac, this son, is going to survive and grow up, and Ishmael's on the side going, he's mocking throughout the entire thing, mocking. That gets on Sarah's nerves. And so Sarah says it's time that they get out of the house. They get out of the house. Drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. It's interesting how often we refer to Ishmael here and we never use his name. Notice that? Sarah's not even willing to give him the honor of calling him by name. The son of Hagar. Won't be an heir. So the matter distressed Abraham greatly because of his son. This is his son, Ishmael is. But God said to Abraham, don't be distressed because of the lad and your maid. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her. For through Isaac your descendants shall be named. And of the son of the maid I will make a nation also, because he is your descendant. So in this case, as opposed to the first case when Hagar was cast out, Abraham has a connection with God, and God goes ahead and he talks to Abraham and says, you know, what Sarah says, yeah, let's do that. And by the way, in doing that, you're not killing Ishmael. You're not killing Ishmael. Why? Because Ishmael is also going to become a nation. He's going to be a lot of people. So send him away. I'll take care of him. I'll make him a nation of people. You're not condemning him to death, but he needs to get out of the household. That's what he's saying right here. And so he does it. So she departed, wandered about in the wilderness of Beersheba. But God heard the lad crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what's the matter with you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the lad where he is. And then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went, filled the skin with water, gave the lad a drink. And God saves him in the wilderness. God was with the lad, and he grew, and he lived in the wilderness, became an archer. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. And that is the last we see Hagar. So they're cast out. They go down to Paran, which is actually in the deep south in the desert next to the Gulf of Aqaba presently today. They go down there and they live down there, and he survives. We never hear from her again. Hagar's gone. But Ishmael survives. Ishmael comes back one more time in the Bible narrative, one more time. And that one time he comes back is when he and his half-brother Isaac bury Abraham. Interesting. He does come back. So God takes care of him. So goodbye, Hagar. We're not going to see you again. Now here's our next glimpse of Abimelech. The story goes on in chapter 21. Same Abimelech. Now it came about at that time. So this is about 3 years after the case we just saw a second ago with Abimelech. It came about at that time that Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, I like that name, Phicol. It sounds like it ought to be a radio company. Phicol International. So Phicol, the commander of his army, spoke to Abraham saying, God is with you in all that you do. See, so Abimelech does know that Abraham has a very strong advocate in God, everything he does. So when someone comes to you like this, what's next? If someone came to you and said, I happen to know that you're very rich and powerful and you're well connected. I need something. And that's exactly what happens. Now, therefore, swear to me here by God that you will not deal falsely with me or with my offspring or with my posterity, but according to the kindness that I have shown to you, you shall show to me and to the land in which you have sojourned. So what he's asking for is a mutual pact of protection and respect, is what he's saying. He starts out by saying, listen, I know that God's with you. Everything you do, God's with you, it seems like. So can we have a treaty? That's what he's asking for. Can we just have a general treaty so that, that you won't deal falsely with me? And what he's saying between the lines is, like when you dealt false with me when you lied about Sarah. Can we have a treaty that will respect one another? We can live in the land together because, by the way, Abraham is living in parts of the area that belong to Abimelech. Can we just have a treaty? And basically, if we have this treaty and we sign it together, you won't sick your God on me and he won't wake me up in the middle of the night and say, you're a dead man. He's basically saying, can we have a treaty, is what he's saying, with this very powerful man who seems to be visibly connected and advocated through God. So he's just asking for a treaty. It's very interesting because he almost brought death to him. And Abraham said, okay, so I swear it. So they have this treaty, which is a remarkable thing to me after what Abraham has put him through already. But Abraham complained. He thought for a second and said, Abimelech, because of the well of water which the servants of Abimelech had seized. Turns out wells are a big deal in this part of the country. You live by a well and having water in it. In fact, the whole wars were started over controls of these wells. And it seems like this well is here, and Abraham is saying, okay, we'll do this treaty. I swear to it, we're going to do it. But we do have this outstanding issue about this well. There's this well. You seized it, and we need to deal with that. So Abimelech says, I don't know who's done this thing. You did not tell me, nor did I hear it of until today. It's something I don't know about, Abimelech says. So Abraham says, you shall take these 7 ewe lambs from my hand so that it may be a witness to me that I dug this well. So what he's going to do in a second here, he's going to take 7 ewe lambs and he's going to give them to him kind of as an offering. It's like a contract. In legal terms, it's called a consideration. For a consideration, a payment of a sum, the contract is sealed. He's going to give him these 7 ewe lambs and say, if you accept these 7 ewe lambs as my offering, you're going to be saying that actually I dug this well and it belongs to me, even though you seized it. So just so we can make this clear. Well, he accepts the sheep. Therefore, he called that place Beersheba, because there the 2 of them took an oath. So they made a covenant at Beersheba. And Abimelech and Phicol, the commander of his army, arose, returned to the land of the Philistines. So they made this deal in the desert about this mutual non-destruction kind of treaty, as well as who really owns this well. It belongs to Abraham. He dug it, after all. There were many wars that happened because of the wells in that part of the country. And it comes up later as Genesis goes on, where people will dig a well, and then your enemies will come and drive you out one day, and they'll fill the well back up with sand and dirt. And then you go back and have to redig it again. It's just a nasty kind of thing. Beersheba actually exists to this very day in southern Israel. In fact, when you look at the descriptions of the extent of the nation of Israel from here on in Genesis, it's always referred to the extent of Israel is from Dan, which is way in the north, to Beersheba in the south. Beersheba is always considered the southernmost end. And Beersheba, well, we already looked at one title for a well before. Remember the Be'er Lahai Roi? First time that Hagar was cast out, God brought her to a well and says, this is the well, Be'er, of the living one, Lahai Roi, who sees. So Be'er means well. So you're halfway to knowing what Beersheba means. Be'er means well. Sheba, it actually comes from the word that means to take an oath. It's sort of a play on words. It's very close to the word for 7 as well. So it either means 7 wells or the well of an oath. And actually, in this case with the 7 ewe lambs, it's both in a sense. It's the place where an oath was taken and we agreed to live one another. And so that's where Beersheba is, even to this day. They took an oath, so they made a covenant. And then there was peace with them, at least between Abraham and Abimelech. So Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And that closes this second view of Abimelech. But why a tamarisk tree? This is a real tamarisk tree. Do you notice the fertility of the land around the tamarisk tree? And sure enough, to this day, if you go to Israel, you'll see tamarisk trees in the strangest places, in places where nothing lives. Nothing lives. Tamarisk trees seem to be able to do that. They can grow where nothing lives. If you go to Beersheba, nothing lives in Beersheba, even to this day. Unless you're irrigated, it's just a wasteland. So why would Abraham, at the end of this successful treaty, this agreement about this well, after putting behind him the whole Sarah's my sister stupid episode, all that kind of stuff, why would Abraham plant a tamarisk tree in this area? Plus, when the tamarisk tree was planted there, how big was it? Oh, small, probably. He didn't have one of those big trucks today that digs trees out of the ground, and puts it down, and you suddenly have a 20-foot tree. It was a small tree. So think about this. He goes out to this arid spot where nothing can live, and he plants this little tree. It's not Arbor Day. So why does he plant this? What's his motivation for planting this? And if you look at the fact that a tree is a statement of rest and shade, but it grows very slowly. In fact, he's planting a tree not for himself. He's planting a tree for his descendants, because it's going to take a while for it to grow and actually be like this tamarisk tree you see right here. It's a metaphorical way for you to see Abraham saying, this is a monumental day. What God brought here, what God had established in terms of peace with my neighbors and all that kind of stuff, because of God's intervention on my behalf. This is a place where there's going to be a place of promise for my children to come. I'm going to plant a tree. And soon that tree over generations will grow and it'll flourish. It'll provide the little shade there is in this entire area, and people will come here and say, there's the well of the oath of the 7 oath, and there's the tree that Father Abraham planted for our benefit, not for his own. So it's really a statement of his legacy that's going to come after that. And this is where Abraham calls the Lord the everlasting God. And so you get the sense that there's an eternal sense here that Abraham is saying, God promised to me this entire land, But this is the first time I've actually seen God intervene so that the land is really mine. This is a remarkable thing. I'm actually seeing it come into existence before my very eyes. He created this treaty with these guys from Gerar, Abimelech, and Phicol. God did all that. It was nothing that Abraham did in a really clever, contractual kind of way. God did that. This is the very first time that Abraham can stick his feet on the ground and say, God has made this place for me, and create a contract with these guys. And it's for a long time. I'm planting a tamarisk tree to testify to the everlasting God. So in this episode today, we see two huge promises of God to Abraham come true. Number one, you'll have a legacy through your seed, through your son. It takes 25 years of Abraham and Sarah after they leave Ur. 25 years of getting older and older and older, and biological clocks not only running out, but just falling apart, you know? And then finally today, Isaac is born. And Sarah's walking around saying, God has given me laughter. That's what Isaac means, laughter. Can you believe it? He's done this. And then here, God puts a stake in the ground in the southernmost tip of what's known as General Israel and says, this place is yours. I've even made an agreement with Abimelech, who seemed to have dibs on this area, and he's good with it. Really? Really? So you have the promise of the descendants through Isaac, the promise of the land here in the southern extent in Beersheba, so much so that here's a well that means the well of the oath. Now, many people say, is it the well of the oath between Abraham and Abimelech? Or is it the well of the oath between Abraham and God? And many people think it's both at the same time. This is a place where God promised. This is the well for him. Okay. Abraham sojourned in the land of the Philistines for many days. So there was peace with Abimelech, and it was a wonderful place to live. Okay, let's wrap this up. You know, we just put our feet into a whole bunch of different episodes. And you're thinking, what is all this stuff? Well, there's a lot of characters that come and go. We've seen the end of Lot. We've seen the end of Hagar. We've seen the end of Lot's daughters. We've seen Abimelech show up. He'll show up again later. A lot of, if you were doing a stage play, you'd say this is where all the characters kind of get reset, stuff like that. But as I was thinking through it, one thing is really a fascinating thing. We talked about the Sarah is my sister episode. And what I want to do is just quickly contrast the difference between the Sarah is my sister episode from way back, several chapters early, and the Sarah is my sister episode that happened today with Abimelech. It's a very interesting thing. Many times when I do marital counseling, premarital counseling, we talk about these two scenes with Abraham selling his sister, selling Sarah short several times. And we talk about the ramifications of that, about how Abraham was a jerk and he kind of dismissed his responsibilities for protecting Sarah. And yet Sarah, in a really righteous kind of way, instead of blowing the whistle, she submitted and allowed God to protect her, and God does. But that's not what I want to talk about. What I want to talk about is the two differences between Abimelech's response and Pharaoh's response. So for instance, look at this. There's two reactions from the two leaders. Back in Genesis 12, here's Pharaoh's reaction. Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they escorted him away. Get out of town. And we're so interested that you get out of town, we're going to escort you to the limits of our land, just to make sure you're out of here. That was the very warm welcome he got from Pharaoh, because he said Sarah was his sister. Now contrast that with Abimelech. What does Abimelech do? Abimelech says, behold, my land's before you. Settle wherever you please. That's odd, don't you think? Two different reactions. Well, let's continue this thought for a second. Abraham's character doesn't improve in these two stories. It's not as though Abimelech now agrees and is a friend of Abraham because Abraham has just gotten so much better. What a godly man he's become. Because he's even making worse explanations. Well, she really is my sister. So you can't explain the two reactions because Abraham's character has gotten better. In Genesis 12, he says, please say that you're my sister. And then in Genesis 20, he says, well, besides, she actually is my sister. So Abraham's character is not getting better. It's kind of stuck someplace. And yet, the response from these two men of power is vastly different. Let's keep looking. God's character was unchanged through all this. God is who God is, and God protected Sarah with Pharaoh. He protected Sarah with Abimelech. God interceded. God looked into it. There was nothing about Abraham's deception and just idiocy that God couldn't handle. God had it all in control. God's character was the same in this. So here we go. So Abraham's character is the same, and he's an idiot. God's character is the same, and he's powerful and seeing and intervening to protect Sarah. Okay? Keep those in mind. Fourth point. They're both irritated by Abraham's character. Irritation's a small word. Pharaoh says, "What is this you've done to me?" And Abimelech says, "You've done to me things that ought not to be done." They almost sound like cousins. And then they're both exactly right. They're both irritated at the character of Abraham. So again, interestingly enough, because of the silly thing that Abraham did, these two kings, Pharaoh and Abimelech, they're acting differently, but they're acting the same. They're both irritated at Abraham for what he's done. Okay, let's keep going and see where we get to on this. But however, they are both shaken by God's character. Pharaoh says in Genesis 12:17, "But the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues." Remember, that's what happened to protect Sarah. He hits him with plagues. And sounds reminiscent of what will happen when Moses comes back to free the nation of Israel so much later. But he hits him with plagues, just so that Pharaoh doesn't miss the message. This God is in control. He's doing this. Abimelech is shaken. "Behold, you're a dead man," God says, because of the woman whom you've taken. I just like that line. I can't think of a worse thing than having a nice night of sleep, and then this dream, God wakes you up and says, "You're a dead man." So they both understand, unequivocally, they understand the power of God and the intercession that God is doing on behalf of Sarah and Abraham, even though they're strongly irritated by who Abraham is. And yet they have two different reactions. Where do you get the two different reactions? You notice that? Well, what occurred to me is that people also react to those who follow Jesus in two ways today as well. And it's not because we are getting better in our godliness. Sometimes we are stuck like Abraham is stuck. Sometimes we can be as infantile and stupid and manipulative and thinking we're getting away with stuff and manipulating the situation. And people see right through that. They're irritated by that. And yet, some people will react to the presence of God in our lives in a negative way like Pharaoh, some in a positive way like Abimelech. And yet it has nothing to do with us, because the two reactions here had nothing to do with Abraham. It had everything to do with the presence of God in their lives. See, that's what's really interesting in these two things. And judging who's going to be reacting positively, who's going to react negatively, well, I don't know. But the good news is that you don't have to reform yourself so that the message of the gospel can get through. Now, God is in the process of reforming us from the inside out. His Spirit does do that, and that does change with time. But even still, that is not what draws people to Christ or drives them away. It's Christ himself that does that. And we carry that message in this, what Paul calls these cracked pots. We carry this message in earthen vessels, is what he says. Common carriers is what we are. And it's not the carrier that makes people change and respect God. It's God himself. It's what's in the pot that makes that happen. So here you've got a case, very interestingly, where Abraham clearly is being an idiot. And yet, in the midst of that, God's presence is changing these two men. It drives one away, Pharaoh. It attracts the other, Abimelech. That's what happens. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 2, "We are a fragrance of Christ to God among those who are being saved and among those who are perishing. To the one, an aroma from death to death. To the other, an aroma from life to life." So here's the deal. God has decided through Abraham and through us to make known who he is in the places we go. And yet, the power of the testimony of who he is has little to do with how good we make ourselves. It has a lot to do with him in us and through us. And that's a key issue right here. Abraham could have done so much better in terms of trying to talk Abimelech or Pharaoh into accepting this God, this everlasting God that he has. He could have done so many things, but he doesn't do them. He fails. In a human sense, he fails. But in a real sense, God as his advocate, the God who he has embraced, the God who, when he looked up at the stars, Abraham says, "I get it, I believe," and God counted it to him in righteousness. That flawed man, Abraham, with God with him, is what convinces Abimelech about who God is. And in the same way with us, the flawed people that we are, who God is actively renovating, and I'm thankful for that from the inside out. But the active renovation is something that God does. It's visible to other people. But me, this earthen jar, what do I have to offer to someone about this God except that God is with me and God has the same offer for them? Basically, the promise exists for them as well as for us. And it's the flawedness of us. We don't have to be these perfect used car salesmen for Jesus. Thank God. So I think that's the irony of this entire thing with Abraham's effect. Abraham did the same kind of childish thing with two great leaders. The one, Pharaoh, recognized the presence and power of God with Abraham, and it drove him away. Abimelech recognized the power and presence of God, and it drew him to him. And so much so that in the story, Abimelech himself seems to react with more fear and respect for God than even Abraham himself. Isn't that ironic? Even though Abraham was a complete failure in the context. So God is in the business of trying to use flawed people. Even though we're failures, somehow he gets his message across. Because he advocates for us flawed people. And for others, you say, but I'm not worthy. I can't come to God. Well, neither am I. And yet he still loves me and died for me. And you can know who he is as well. And I think that's the magical is the wrong word, the kind of amazing message about with these two different cases with Abimelech and Pharaoh, and with a very flawed Abraham. By the way, if I was writing the Bible, I would have left out these two Sarah's My Sister episodes. They're very embarrassing. They're very embarrassing for the father of the nation. Just very embarrassing. And yet the effect on these two great kings is just astonishing. Yeah, Larry. Exactly. I'll pay you $5. That was my segue to finish this morning. Yeah, that's exactly right. Because the next time we come back together, we will see Abraham being the man of faith. After such a short time from being an idiot. And God uses both circumstances. I think that's what's really amazing. God uses both circumstances to convince and compel people that God is near and will advocate for you even when you don't earn it. Gives us all hope. That's exactly right. So we need to be flawed people for that purpose. But God is near. He can do that. So, okay, so next time we come together 2 weeks from now, we'll take a look at this whole thing with Abraham and the sacrifice of Isaac. Okay, let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for how real it is. It sounds like real people, and it is. Real people struggling to be with a real God and coming to understand the limitlessness of your loving kindness toward us. God, your patience for our silliness amazes me. Your patience for Abraham's silliness amazes me. Lord, I wondered all the way through this, how can he risk the descendants that were going to come to him after the angel said you're going to have a son a year from now, and still do this silliness with Abimelech? Put that all in danger. And it's kind of an embarrassing episode for him, but it's also it's a hopeful episode for us. Lord, help us in our unbelief. Grow our faith, we pray. Sometimes we understand with our heads, but our hearts haven't grasped it yet. But we want to. We want to. Because we are convinced of this, Lord. We are convinced of your extraordinary loving kindness shown toward us. Had nothing to do with our worthiness or our ability to change ourselves to make ourselves worthy. That even in our silliness, even in our sinfulness, you came and died for us. And now you advocate for us, for our best. That's extraordinary. So thank you for that great news of hope, even that went as far back as Abraham, in the midst of his flawed flesh, and even with us in the midst of our flawed flesh. Our hearts are still amazed that you called us to yourself and called us to a relationship with you. We love you and we thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's go back to where we started.